Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Hacker News Daily, where we break down the top stories that got the tech community talking. I'm your host, and wow, did we have an interesting mix yesterday. Out of 30 stories that hit the front page, we've pulled the 5 that really captured the community's attention. And let me tell you, the range is wild. We're going from internet censorship and digital resistance to consciousness hacking with breathing techniques, then diving into the economics of AI inference, examining the fragility of open source infrastructure, and wrapping up with yet another tale of corporate acquisition gone wrong. These stories collectively pulled in over 2,500 points and more than 1,600 comments, so you know people had strong feelings about all of this. Let's dive right in with a story that really shows how the global tech community comes together when freedom of information is under threat. All right, so our first story really caught my eye. It's titled, Ask HN. The government of my country blocked VPN access. What should I use? And wow, did this strike a nerve with the community. We're talking 900 points and over 500 comments, which tells you this is hitting close to home for a lot of people. Now, what's fascinating here is that we're apparently talking about Indonesia, though, and this is where it gets interesting, there's actually some dispute about whether this is even happening right now. One Indonesian user, RD07, basically said, "Wait, what? I'm not seeing any blocks here," suggesting it might be an ISP-specific issue rather than a government-wide crackdown. But here's the thing. Whether it's happening in Indonesia right now or not, the response from the Hacker News community was absolutely incredible. It turned into this masterclass on circumventing internet censorship, with people who've dealt with some of the most restrictive regimes in the world sharing their battle-tested strategies. The technical solutions people suggested range from simple to, let's call them, impressively paranoid. On the basic end, you've got your commercial VPNs. Though several users warned these are often the first to get blocked because they're so easy to detect. The conversation quickly escalated to more sophisticated approaches like setting up your own VPS, virtual private server, and running SOCKS 5 or SSH tunnels through it. The logic being, if you control the server and it's not on any block list, you're much harder to detect. But then it gets really interesting. Users started talking about obfuscation layers, tools like OFS4 proxy and shapeshifter that basically disguise your VPN traffic to look like regular HTTPS traffic. One commenter mentioned X-ray with XTLS reality, which, and I love this, makes your VPN traffic look identical to legitimate connections to major websites. The sensors literally can't tell if you're browsing CNN or tunneling through to the free internet. What really stood out to me was the cat and mouse game people described from places like China and Uzbekistan. One user explained how China's Great Firewall has gotten so sophisticated that it's not just blocking protocols anymore, it's doing statistical analysis on traffic patterns. Like, even if your data is encrypted and looks legitimate, if the pattern of packets doesn't match normal browsing behavior, boom, you're blocked. That's next-level censorship right there. The Tor network came up a lot, with people suggesting using Tor bridges. These are unlisted entry points that are harder for governments to block. But even Tor isn't foolproof. Users from heavily censored countries warned that just downloading Tor can flag you for extra scrutiny, and in some places, using it is basically painting a target on your back. One approach that really caught my attention was what I'd call the hide in plain sight method. Instead of trying to tunnel out through traditional means, some users suggested using platforms that are too important for governments to block entirely. Think Google Docs as a proxy, or tunneling through gaming protocols that would cause riots if blocked. There was this fascinating discussion about V2Ray and its various implementations, with users sharing specific configurations that work in different countries. The level of detail was incredible. People were sharing exact server settings, which protocols to use, even which ports are less likely to be monitored. But you know what really struck me? The community solidarity. You had people from all over, Iran, Russia, China, Venezuela, sharing their experiences and helping each other out. One comment that stuck with me was from someone who said, "The internet routes around censorship like water around a rock." And seeing this thread with hundreds of people collaborating to preserve internet freedom, yeah, that feels pretty true. The thread also touched on the ethical and legal implications. Several users reminded everyone that circumventing government blocks might be illegal in their country and to be careful. But others argued that access to information is a human right, and teaching these techniques is a form of digital resistance.
What's wild is how this has become almost routine knowledge in some parts of the world. One user mentioned that in their country, knowing how to set up a VPN tunnel is as common as knowing how to use email. That's a sobering thought about the state of internet freedom globally. And for those wondering about the technical specifics, the consensus seemed to be, if you're serious about this, don't rely on any single solution. Layer your defenses. Use a VPN to a VPS you control, add obfuscation, maybe throw in Tor for good measure, and always have backups. Because as one user put it, the moment you think you've found the perfect solution, that's when they figure out how to block it. Speaking of hacking systems, but in a completely different way, our next story takes us from hacking around censorship to hacking our own consciousness. And the tech community has some thoughts about this one. All right, so here's something fascinating that really caught fire on Hacker News this week. Altered states of consciousness induced by breathwork, accompanied by music. This got over 500 points and nearly 300 comments. And honestly, the more I dug into it, the more I understood why people are so intrigued. So researchers have been looking at what actually happens in your brain when you do this intense breathwork stuff. You know, the kind where you're breathing really fast and deep, often with music playing. And what they found is kind of mind-blowing. These breathing techniques create brain changes that are remarkably similar to what happens when people take psychedelics. We're talking actual, measurable changes in specific brain regions, not just, oh, I feel a bit lightheaded. The study showed that when people do this high ventilation breathwork, HVB is what they're calling it, they experience things like euphoria, bliss, and these perceptual shifts that participants describe as genuinely transformative. And here's the kicker. The intensity of these altered states directly correlates with changes in blood flow to specific parts of the brain. They're seeing activity in the left operculum and posterior insula, which handles how we perceive our breathing and internal body sensations, and also in the right amygdala and anterior hippocampus. That's where we process emotional memories. What's really getting people talking, though, is this idea that breathwork could potentially be a legal, accessible alternative to psychedelic therapy. I mean, think about it. Psychedelic therapy is showing incredible promise for treating depression, PTSD, all sorts of conditions, but it's stuck in regulatory hell in most places. Meanwhile, breathing is, well, it's breathing. Nobody's going to regulate that.
The Hacker News discussion on this is absolutely wild. You've got people sharing these incredibly detailed personal experiments they've been running on themselves. One person's talking about using LED goggles and binaural beats to induce altered states. Another's describing this app called Luminate that uses your phone's flashlight to create strobing patterns that supposedly trigger similar effects. There's even someone discussing, and I'm not making this up, something they call bi-areolar beats, which involves, let's just say, unconventional haptic stimulation techniques. But what I found really interesting is how the discussion bridges ancient practices with cutting-edge neuroscience. Several commenters pointed out that Eastern traditions have been using breathwork, meditation, and rhythmic drumming for thousands of years to achieve these states. One person made this great point about how Western science is essentially catching up to what yogis and shamans have known forever. Except now we can stick people in fMRI machines and actually see what's happening in their brains. Of course, not everyone's buying it. There's this one commenter who basically said, look, people are just hyperventilating until they almost pass out and then calling it a spiritual experience. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong about the physiological part. The study does show that a lot of what's happening is related to changes in CO2 levels and cerebral blood flow.
But does that make the experience less valid or less useful therapeutically? That's where the debate gets really interesting. Another person expressed frustration with how the whole conversation mixes hard science with subjective experiences and spiritual interpretations. They couldn't relate to other users' experiences and found the definitions too vague. And I get it. When you've got people in the same thread talking about peer-reviewed neuroscience papers and then sharing stories about seeing geometric patterns and meeting entities, it can feel like everyone's having completely different conversations. What strikes me about all this is that we're seeing technology and ancient wisdom converging in really unexpected ways. You've got Silicon Valley types building apps to hack their consciousness, researchers using million-dollar brain scanners to validate thousand-year-old practices, and regular people experimenting with everything from strobe lights to specific breathing patterns they learned from YouTube videos. The implications here are pretty huge when you think about it. If simple breathing techniques can create therapeutic brain states similar to psychedelics, that could democratize access to these potentially healing experiences. No prescription needed, no expensive therapy sessions, just you and your lungs. Though obviously the researchers are careful to note that this stuff can be intense and isn't necessarily safe for everyone, especially people with certain health conditions. The whole thing really makes you wonder about consciousness itself, doesn't it? Like, if changing your breathing pattern for 20 minutes can fundamentally alter your perception of reality and create lasting emotional changes, what does that say about the nature of our everyday conscious experience? Are we all just one breathing session away from a completely different state of mind? Now, from altered states of consciousness to altered states of financial reality. Our next story dives into whether the biggest AI companies are actually bleeding money or secretly printing it. All right, so our next story really caught fire on Hacker News. Are OpenAI and Anthropic losing money on inference? And honestly, this one's fascinating because it challenges something we've all just kind of accepted as fact in the AI world. You know how everyone's been saying these AI companies are just hemorrhaging cash, that every time you ask ChatGPT a question, OpenAI is basically lighting money on fire? Well, someone decided to actually sit down and do the math. Napkin math, but still. And their conclusion? These companies might actually be making bank on inference. So here's what this person did. They took DeepSeek R1's architecture as a baseline, which is a 671 billion parameter model, but only activates about 37 billion at a time thanks to mixture of experts. Then they grabbed some H100 GPU pricing, assumed a cluster of 72 GPUs at about $2 an hour each, and started crunching numbers. Their calculation? It costs roughly 52 cents per million tokens to run inference. Now, here's where it gets spicy. Claude Sonnet charges $15 per million output tokens. GPT-4, $60. If these numbers are even remotely accurate, we're talking about gross margins of like 50 to 90%. That's software level margins on what everyone thought was a money-losing operation. The author even went further and suggested that ChatGPT's free tier, the one everyone assumes is a massive loss leader, could actually be profitable if just 10% of users convert to paid plans. They're basically saying the whole AI companies are burning cash narrative might be completely backwards.
But here's the thing, and this is where the Hacker News crowd really tore into this analysis. The comments section is absolutely brutal. We're talking multiple technical experts pointing out that the math is off by factors of 1,000 or more. One commenter literally walked through the calculations and showed how the bandwidth assumptions were completely wrong. Another pointed out that you can't just ignore training costs when you're talking about profitability. I mean, these models cost hundreds of millions to train in the first place. And there's this really interesting point about using DeepSeek as the baseline. Several commenters argued that DeepSeek R1 is exceptionally efficient, way more than what OpenAI or Anthropic are running. It's like calculating the profitability of all car companies based on Tesla's most efficient model. It just doesn't translate. But you know what I find interesting?
even with all these criticisms, there's still this underlying question that nobody can definitively answer. Are these companies actually losing money on inference or not? One commenter defended the article, saying, look, even if the exact numbers are wrong, the general point might still stand. Inference itself could be profitable. It's just the entire business model, including R&D and training, that's expensive. And there's this really interesting point about using DeepSeek as the baseline. Several commenters argued that DeepSeek R1 is exceptionally efficient, way more than what OpenAI or Anthropic are running. It's like calculating the profitability of all car companies based on Tesla's most efficient model. It just doesn't translate. But you know what I find interesting? Even with all these criticisms, there's still this underlying question that nobody can definitively answer. Are these companies actually losing money on inference or not? One commenter defended the article, saying, look, even if the exact numbers are wrong, the general point might still stand. Inference itself could be profitable. It's just the entire business model, including R&D and training, that's expensive. And there's this fascinating subplot about hyperscalers, the big cloud providers. The article suggests they're charging absolutely crazy margins over bare metal costs. If you're an AI company paying retail AWS or Azure prices, you're at a massive disadvantage compared to someone with their own hardware or better deals. So where does this leave us? Honestly, I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. These companies probably aren't losing as much on inference as the doom and gloom narrative suggests, but they're also probably not printing money like this analysis claims. The real costs are in the training, the research, the failed experiments, the massive compute infrastructure.
What really strikes me about this whole debate is how it shows we're still in the Wild West phase of AI economics. We don't really know what sustainable looks like yet. Are we heading toward a world where a few companies with the best models and most efficient inference dominate? Or will open source and more efficient architectures democratize everything? The fact that we can have a 445 comment flame war about basic unit economics tells you everything you need to know about how early we still are in this whole AI revolution thing. Speaking of open source and sustainability, our next story highlights a vulnerability in the tech world that's been hiding in plain sight, and it's honestly terrifying when you think about it. Story 4, open source infrastructure. Now, this next story really struck a nerve in the community. Open source is one person, and wow, did it spark some heated debate with over 350 points and 151 comments on Hacker News. So here's what happened. The Register apparently published something shaming a Russian open source developer, and this author came out swinging with a fascinating counterargument. They're basically saying, look, you're focused on the wrong thing here. You're focused on where someone's from, when the real terrifying reality is that most open source software, the stuff that literally runs our entire digital world, is maintained by just one person. And they brought receipts. Using data from Ecosystems, which tracks 11.8 million open source projects, they found that about 7 million of these projects have exactly one maintainer, one person. Another 4 million projects, we don't even know how many maintainers they have. Think about that for a second. We're talking about roughly 60% of all tracked open source projects being somebody's solo side project. The author doesn't mince words either. They literally write, the software running the whole fucking planet is written by one person. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong. How many times have we seen critical infrastructure depending on some random NPM package maintained by someone in their spare time? Now, the Hacker News discussion got really interesting because people started picking apart this argument from different angles. Some folks are saying this is absolutely a supply chain nightmare, especially for military and government systems. They're pointing out that it's not even about the technical risk, it's a governance issue. What happens during wartime? What if a maintainer is forced to cooperate with their government? These aren't hypothetical scenarios anymore. But then you've got the skeptics, and they make some solid points too.
They're arguing that these statistics are misleading. Like, okay, 7 million single-person projects sounds terrifying, but how many of those are abandoned hello world experiments? How many are simple API wrappers that got published once and never touched again? One commenter pointed out that NPM download counts are basically meaningless because CI/CD systems inflate them like crazy. Every build, every test run, it all counts as a download. There's also this fascinating technical nuance that came up. Apparently, the way package.json lists maintainers might not reflect reality at all. You could have dozens of contributors actively working on a project, but if only one person's name is in that maintainer field, it looks like a solo operation in the data. What really gets me about this whole discussion is how it highlights this fundamental tension in open source. We've built our entire technological civilization on top of software that's often maintained by volunteers working in their free time. And whether it's one person or 5 people, is that really the issue? The XZUtils backdoor attempt earlier this year showed us that even projects with multiple maintainers can be vulnerable to social engineering and burnout. The geopolitical angle is interesting too because the author's trying to reframe the conversation away from should we trust developers from certain countries to should we trust any critical infrastructure that has a bus factor of 1? But some commenters are pushing back, saying, actually, both things can be problems. Just because single maintainers are risky doesn't mean nationality-based supply chain concerns are invalid. You know what this really reminds me of? That XKCD comic about modern digital infrastructure. You know, the one with all these impressive blocks representing technology stacks, and then at the bottom, there's this tiny piece labeled some random project maintained by a random person in Nebraska since 2003? Except now we have data showing it's not just a joke, it's actually how most of open source works. The conversation also touched on what we should actually do about this. Better funding for maintainers, more corporate involvement, but then you risk losing what makes open source special in the first place. It's this impossible balance between needing reliability and security while maintaining the openness and accessibility that made this ecosystem so innovative. And speaking of corporate involvement in open source, well, our final story shows exactly what can go wrong when big companies get their hands on community resources. Story 5. Vietnamese shutdown.
All right, so our last story is something that's got the developer community pretty fired up, and honestly, I can see why. We're talking about the deletion of docker.io/bitnami, and this one's sitting at 336 points with 230 comments on Hacker News, which tells you right away that people have opinions about this. So here's what's happening. Broadcom, who now owns VMware after that massive acquisition, is essentially pulling the plug on the free docker.io/bitnami container registry. Come September 29th, 2024, it's gone. Just delete it. And if you want to keep using Bitnami container images, well, you've got 2 choices. Either migrate to their shiny new Bitnami secure images, which, surprise, surprise, costs money, or use something called the Bitnami Legacy Registry, which sounds about as appealing as it sounds. Now, what's really interesting here is how they're doing this. They're not just flipping a switch one day. No, they've got this whole brownout strategy where they're temporarily disabling just 10 container images at a time for 24-hour periods. August 28-29, September 2-3, September 17-18. Mark your calendars if you're using any of these. It's like they're giving you a taste of what life will be like without free access. Kind of a, hey, better migrate now or else approach. That's rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. And you know what? The community is not happy about this. Reading through the comments, there's this overwhelming sense of, here we go again with Broadcom. People are drawing direct parallels to what happened with VMware licensing after the acquisition. Same playbook, different product. One commenter literally called it a rug pull, and honestly, that's not an unfair characterization. What's fascinating is the debate about whether Bitnami even adds that much value in the first place. Several commenters are pointing out that Bitnami essentially takes open source software, packages it up nicely, and
that's kind of it. They're not the maintainers of Postgres or Redis or whatever. They're just wrapping these tools in containers. And now they want, get this, starting at $50,000 annually for access to these packaged versions. $50,000 for containerized open source software that you could technically package yourself. There's a Bitnami representative in the comments trying to do damage control, emphasizing that all the build scripts and everything remain open source on GitHub under Apache 2 license. Their argument is basically, look, we're not closing the source, we're just not giving you free hosting anymore. Which, okay, fair point on a technical level, but it still feels like a bait and switch to the thousands of developers who build their workflows around these free resources. One interesting perspective came from a commenter who brought up the EU's Cyber Resilience Act, suggesting that maybe this kind of commercialization is actually necessary for the sustainability of open source. Their argument is that if regulations are going to require more accountability and security guarantees, someone needs to pay for that work. And maybe this creates opportunities for developers to actually get compensated for maintaining critical infrastructure. But most people aren't buying that angle. The overwhelming sentiment is that this is just Broadcom doing what Broadcom does, acquiring companies and squeezing every penny out of their user base. People are comparing them to Oracle, which, if you know anything about Oracle's reputation in the developer community, that's not a compliment. What's really telling is how many people in the comments are already sharing migration strategies. Just use the official images, some are saying. Others are talking about building their own containers from scratch. There's even discussion about alternative registries and whether this might push more people toward things like GitHub Container Registry or AWS ECR. The timing of this is particularly rough because as of August 28th, they've already stopped publishing new Bitnami container images to Docker Hub in OCI format. So the writing's been on the wall, but September 29th is when the hammer really drops. You know what this reminds me of? It's like when your favorite local coffee shop gets bought by a chain and suddenly that free Wi-Fi you've been using for years requires a purchase, and the purchase minimum keeps going up. Sure, they have the right to do it, but it fundamentally changes the relationship with the community that helped build their success in the first place. The broader implication here is pretty concerning for the open source ecosystem. If every useful open source tool eventually gets wrapped up by a company that gets acquired by a larger company that then monetizes it aggressively, where does that leave developers? Especially smaller teams and individual developers who relied on these free resources. This whole situation is a masterclass in how not to handle a transition if you care about community goodwill. The brownouts, the aggressive pricing, and the relatively short migration timeline, it all adds up to a pretty clear message. Broadcom views the Bitnami user base as a revenue opportunity, not a community to nurture. And based on those 230 comments, the community is getting the message loud and clear.
And that wraps up today's dive into yesterday's top hacker news stories. What a journey, right? We went from digital resistance against censorship to hacking our own consciousness with breathing, questioned whether AI companies are secretly profitable, exposed the fragility of our open source infrastructure, and witnessed yet another community resource fall victim to corporate acquisition. If there's a thread connecting all these stories, it's about control and access. Who controls the internet? Who controls our consciousness? Who controls AI economics? Who controls open source? And who controls the tools developers rely on? These aren't just technical discussions. They're fundamentally about power, freedom, and the future of technology. The fact that these 5 stories generated over 2,500 points and 1,600 comments tells you something important. The Hacker News community isn't just interested in the latest JavaScript framework or startup round. They're grappling with the big questions about how technology shapes our world and how we can keep it open, accessible, and free. Thanks for listening to the Hacker News Daily. If you found value in this deep dive into yesterday's top stories, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's episode. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and keep that hacker spirit alive. I'll see you tomorrow with another round of the stories that matter most to the tech community.